Everybody in that county thought they knew how the story ended before it began. The widow gets nothing. The nephew gets the land. That was the arithmetic of the thing, plain as a fence line, and folks had already decided which side of it they'd stand on. I know because I was one of them. I'd done the math too. I'm here to tell you the math was wrong. Not because somebody cheated it, because somebody had been carrying the real numbers in her apron pocket for 11 years, and she never once let on. What you're about to hear is how a woman with dirt under her nails and grief in her spine walked into a room full of men who'd already buried her, and how she made every last one of them dig her back up. Stay with me. The part you're waiting for isn't the part that'll get you. The rain hadn't let up in 3 days when I first understood something was wrong with Della Marchetti. I'd ridden over to the Kessler place. That's what we still called it, though old man Kessler had been in the ground a week by then, to return a post-hole digger I'd borrowed the summer before and never gotten around to bringing back. Small thing. The kind of small thing a man uses as an excuse to go look at a widow and see how bad off she is, and tell himself he's just being neighborly. My name's Emmett Boone. I run cattle 2 ridges east and I keep a log. Have since I was a boy, weather, births, deaths, the price of feed, who said what to whom at the feed store. My wife, before she passed, used to say I'd write down my own funeral if somebody handed me a pencil at it. She wasn't wrong. I write things down because if I don't, they slip, and I've lost enough that slipped. So I've got the entry, October the 9th, road to Kessler's, Della on the porch not moving, something off. She was sitting in the rocker that didn't rock anymore. The runner had cracked years back and Kessler never fixed it, so it just sat there rigid, a chair pretending to be something it wasn't, and she had her hands folded in her lap the way you fold them at a graveside. Still. Too still. The rain was coming off the porch roof in a gray sheet not 2 feet from her boots, and she was watching it like it was telling her something. Della, I said. She didn't jump. That was the first thing. A woman alone on a ranch after her husband dies, you call her name out of the wet dark and she ought to startle. Della just turned her head slow, like it cost her. Emmett, her voice had gravel in it, you bring back my digger. I did. 11 years late. About that. The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile, the memory of where a smile used to live. Said it by the barn, you want coffee, there's coffee. There wasn't coffee. I found out later there wasn't much of anything in that house by then. Kessler had let the place run down in his last years the way sick men do, spending money on doctors in town and letting the fences rot. But she offered it like a woman who still had a pantry, and I understood that the offering was the point, not the coffee. Pride is a thing you feed even when you're starving. I sat with her on that porch for the better part of an hour. She didn't cry. I kept waiting for it, the way you brace for thunder after the flash, and it never came. Instead, she talked about the weather and the cattle she'd have to sell, and how the roof over the east bedroom had started letting water. Ordinary things. The whole time her hands stayed folded in her lap, and it wasn't until I got up to leave that I saw what was in them. A ledger. Small leather, swollen from damp and use, the corners soft as cloth. She'd been holding it the entire time, under her folded hands, the way you'd hold a bird you didn't want anyone to know you'd caught. What's that? I said, not really a question. Her fingers closed over it, bookkeeping. Kessler's. Mine, and something came into her face then, not grief, not the still gray nothing she'd worn the whole hour, something with an edge on it. You know what they're saying in town, Emmett. I didn't want to say it. They're saying the will reading's Thursday, she went on, sparing me, and Carl gets the land and I get shown the road. That's what they're saying. Carl was the nephew, Kessler's sister's boy, come out from back east 2 years back when the old man took sick, all handshakes and Sunday manners, telling anybody who'd listen how he was helping his uncle get his affairs in order. I'd never liked him. He had a way of looking at a piece of ground like he was already counting the money it'd bring, and a way of looking at Della like she was part of the ground. Is that what's going to happen? I asked. Della looked back out at the rain. held the ledger a little tighter, and she said something I wrote down that night, word for word, because it stuck in me like a splinter and I've never gotten it all the way out. "A man can leave you nothing," she said, "and still leave you everything. Depends on what you were paying attention to while he wasn't." Then she got up, that ledger tucked into her apron, and went inside, and the screen door clapped shut behind her like the last word in an argument I hadn't known we were having. I need to tell you about the 11 years, because the town had them wrong, and the town's version is the one that nearly won. The town's version went like this. Della was Kessler's second wife, married late, no children, a woman who came from nothing and married up. When Kessler's first wife died, the story went, he'd been lonely and foolish and let a younger woman with a hard face and no family move into his house and his name. She cooked and she kept house and she was around, the way a hired girl is around, and now that the old man was gone she'd find out exactly how much a hired girl inherits. Which is to say, the clothes on her back and a ride to the county line. Here's what the town didn't know, and what I only pieced together after, some from Della, some from that ledger she let me read the night everything came apart, some from the men who were in the room Thursday and never told it straight because the straight version made them look like fools. Della hadn't married up. She'd married a dying operation and spent 11 years keeping it from going under. Kessler was a rancher of the old kind, good with stock, bad with money, the sort of man who could read a sky but couldn't read a contract. When his first wife was alive, she'd kept the books, and when she died the books went to hell inside of 2 years. He was a season away from losing the whole place to the bank when he married Della, and I don't think, this is the part that took me longest to understand, I don't think he married her for it. I think he married her because he was lonely and she was kind to him. And then she looked at his books, and she saw a man drowning, and she did what she was made to do. She started keeping numbers. 11 years of numbers, every head of cattle bought and sold, every loan, every payment. Every dollar she scraped and saved and hid in coffee cans against the bad years, and there were bad years. She renegotiated the note with the bank herself, rode into town and sat across from a man who wouldn't look at her and made him look at her by the time she left. She'd bought the North Parcel in a tax sale in '86 with money she'd saved out of egg sales, 3 cents at a time, and put it in. Well, that's the Thursday part. I'm getting ahead. The point is this. For 11 years, Della Marchetti had been the reason there was anything left to leave. And Kessler, God rest him, was a man who couldn't fix a chair runner or say thank you out loud to save his life. But he wasn't stupid. And he wasn't ungrateful. He was just quiet about it, the way that generation was quiet about everything that mattered, so quiet you could mistake it for absence. He'd been paying attention, too, to what she was doing, to what it cost her. She just didn't know how much until Thursday. Thursday it was still raining. The will was read in the front room of Harlan Price's law office in town, which was really just the front room of Harlan Price's house, with a desk and some law books and a window that looked out on the muddy street. I wasn't invited. I went anyway, on the excuse of business with Price I didn't have, and I stood in the hall by the coat pegs where I could hear through the door, and I'm not ashamed of it. Some things you need to witness even when they're not yours to witness. Carl was there early. I heard him before I saw him, that big confident voice, working the room, telling Price how he'd already been in touch with a fellow about surveying the property, how he figured he'd run more head than his uncle had, how it was a shame about Della, but she'd surely understand these things had to be handled properly. He'd brought his wife, a thin woman in town clothes who kept looking at the door like she was worried it'd let in something with mud on its boots. Then Della came. I saw her through the crack of the door. She'd worn black, a good dress, old but good, the kind you keep in a cedar chest for funerals and weddings and the 2 or 3 days in a life when the world decides who you are. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were empty. She'd left the ledger somewhere, and for a wild second I thought she'd given up, that she'd decided to walk in with nothing after all and let them have it. She sat down across from Carl, She folded her empty hands, and she waited. Price cleared his throat and started reading, and the room went quiet, and out in the hall I held my breath and pressed my ear to the wood. The first part was the ordinary part, being of sound mind, the disposition of small things, a watch to a cousin, some money to the church. Carl shifting in his chair, impatient, waiting for the only sentence he'd come to hear. And then Price read it. And out in the hall, I understood that the town had been wrong, and Carl had been wrong, and even I, God help me, I had been a little wrong, because a man had been paying attention, and he'd left the widow everything. But it's how he left it that you need to hear. And that's where I have to stop, because the how is the whole story, and the how is where Della finally, after 11 dry years. You'd think the will was the end of it. A man leaves his wife the ranch, the nephew loses, the widow wins, roll the credits. But a piece of paper is only as strong as the men willing to honor it, and there were men in that county who decided long before Thursday that Della Marchetti's name on a deed didn't mean what a man's name would mean. What happened after the reading is the part I've never been able to shake, the part where I learned that winning something and keeping it are two different animals, and only one of them has teeth. Stay with me to the end. There's a thing Della did with that ledger that I still can't decide was mercy or its opposite, and I've had 20 years to think about it. Price read it plain, no ornament, the way lawyers do so nobody can claim later they didn't hear it. The entirety of the estate, the home ranch, the stock, the accounts, the north parcel to his wife Della, all of it, unconditional. And then the part nobody expected. The part that made Carl's chair scrape back so hard I heard it clear out in the hall. Kessler had written a codicil. His own words, Price said, that he'd insisted be read aloud exactly as set down. And Price read them, and I've got them in my log because Della gave me the copy later, and they went like this, near enough. The north parcel and the water rights that come with it are not mine to give. They were bought with my wife's money, saved from her own labor, and titled in my name only because in this county a bank would sooner lend to a dead man than a living woman. I am setting the record straight while I am able. That land was always hers. Everything else is hers because she earned it keeping a foolish old man from losing what his first family left him. I know what I am. I know what she did. Let no one in that room pretend otherwise. The room went dead quiet. Out in the hall I had my knuckles pressed against my mouth. Then Carl started talking. I won't give you all of it. It was ugly and it got uglier. He said the old man wasn't in his right mind. He said Della had gotten to him, had worked on him, and here his voice climbed, taken advantage of a sick old fool. He said he'd fight it. He had a lawyer back east. He'd tie the whole thing up in court for years, and everybody knew a ranch couldn't survive years in court. Everybody knew Della didn't have the money to fight. Everybody knew. And that's when Della stood up. She'd been silent the whole time. Folded hands, black dress, empty. She let Carl run himself out the way you let a bad horse run itself out, and when he finally stopped for breath she reached down beside her chair, where she'd set it, where I couldn't see it from the hall, and she put the ledger on Price's desk. "Read it," she said. Price looked at her. "Not the will," Della said. "This. Read the entries for the north parcel. Read the bank negotiation of '84. Read whose signature renegotiated the note Carl's uncle couldn't pay." Her voice never rose, that's what I remember. Carl had shouted the whole room hot and Della came in cool as well water. Carl says his uncle wasn't in his right mind. All right. Let's leave his uncle's mind out of it. Let's talk about the numbers. Numbers don't have a mind to be out of. And Price, who was an honest man, which was the one thing in that room Carl hadn't accounted for, Price opened the ledger. And he read. "I want to tell you she destroyed him with it. That make a cleaner story. The truth is quieter and it stayed with me longer for being quiet. She didn't destroy Carl. The ledger did something worse than destroy him. It revealed him, to himself, in front of his thin wife and Harlan Price and the county, which would hear every word of this by Saturday. Because what Price read out, entry by entry in that flat lawyer's voice, was 11 years of a woman's work that a man had walked into a room prepared to steal, and every number was a small, unanswerable fact, and you cannot shout down a fact the way you can shout down a woman. Carl tried. It didn't take. By the fourth or fifth entry, his wife had put her hand on his arm and he'd shaken it off. And by the 10th, she'd stopped trying and just stared at the floor. And I understood that whatever the court back east eventually said, this marriage had already reached its own verdict in this room. Here's the thing I've turned over for 20 years. Della had one more entry she could have had Price read. I know because she showed it to me later, the night she let me read the whole ledger by lamplight in that kitchen with the leaking roof. Near the back, in Kessler's own shaky hand, not hers, there was a note. He'd written it maybe a year before he died. And it recorded, in a sick man's scrawl, that Carl had come to him twice asking to be put in the will, and had, on the second visit, suggested that maybe the old man ought to consider that Della was only after the place and might not stick around once he was gone. Carl had tried to poison a dying man against his own wife, to get the land, and Kessler had written it down, because Della had taught him, over 11 years, that you write down what matters so it can't slip, and he'd never told her, and there it sat. She could have had Price read it, in front of Carl's wife, in front of the county. It would have finished Carl in this part of the world for good, ended him socially the way a bullet ends a horse. She didn't. I asked her why, that night by the lamp. She was quiet a long time, and the rain had finally stopped, and you could hear the roof still dripping into the pot she'd set under the leak, a slow, patient sound. Because, she said, the will was Kessler telling the truth about me. That last note, that's just Kessler telling the truth about Carl, and I've got what I need from the first one. She closed the ledger. I don't need to win twice. Winning twice is just cruelty wearing a Sunday coat. I know the difference. I had 11 years to learn it. I said something then. I don't remember what, something about how Carl didn't deserve the mercy. And she looked at me, and there was that edge again, the one I'd seen on the porch, but under it something tired and clear. It's not for him, she said. Mercy's never for the one who gets it. It's for the one who gives it. It's the last thing I get to keep that Carl can't touch. You think I'm going to hand that over too? Carl fought it. He did have a lawyer back east, and he did tie things up for a while, and it was a hard 18 months. There were seasons Della nearly went under. I lent her men at branding, and I wasn't the only neighbor who found reasons to be useful, because the county had heard the ledger story by then, and the county had changed its mind about who Della Marchetti was. Turns out a woman who saves egg money 3 cents at a time for a tax sale is a woman folks will show up for, once they finally see her. The court ruled for Della. The codicil held, the ledger held, and Kessler's plain words about the north parcel held hardest of all, because a dead man's confession that the law had done his wife wrong is a thing even a court has trouble arguing with. Carl went back east. His wife, I heard, didn't go with him. Della ran that ranch another 19 years. Ran it well, better than Kessler ever had, though she'd never say so. She fixed the roof the first summer. She never did fix the rocker on the porch, though. I asked her about it once, years on, why she kept a broken chair that wouldn't rock. She said she liked being reminded that a thing could be broken and still hold you up if you knew how to sit in it. She's gone now too, has been a few years. She left the ranch to a niece of her own, a young woman who keeps books, and I hear the north parcel's still in the family, still watered, still hers by right and by name. I've still got my log, all of it, October the 9th, and the porch and the ledger under her folded hands. And that line I wrote down before I understood it, that I understand now every time I read it back. A man can leave you nothing and still leave you everything. Depends on what you were paying attention to while he wasn't. She was paying attention the whole time, 11 years of it, and the rest of us thought she had nothing, right up until the morning she didn't. I never did get that post-hole digger back.